Well, welcome everybody to this breakout session on open source. I'm really glad to be here, and I want to first just thank Oracle Cloud for sponsoring this session. I think it's really important. So I'm going to do a bit of housekeeping, and then I'll introduce our guests here on the panel, and then we'll get started. So first, I just want to remind people, unlike the big session that we were just in, we're going to do question cards. So those should be, I think, on your seats. And if you have questions, don't wait till the end, pass them to the aisle, and we're going to make the aisle person put their hands up, and so the cards can be picked up. And that way we can make sure that we get questions from the audience at the end. I also want to just mention that media may be present during this session, which would actually be good. And this is not available for continuing education credit. So those are my little housekeeping things. I was hoping for that credit, as I'm still continuing my education, but usually the hard way. So today, I just want to say I'm really grateful. We have a great panel here today. My friend Ellen McCarthy, who was Assistant Secretary for INR when I was in my old job, but now has a whole big job of her own as CEO of, what is the name of your company again?
Truth in Media.
Truth in Media. Tim, I always just use the acronym. We have Brad Alskog. No, L silent, Oskog. Sorry, I said I wasn't going to screw this up beforehand. From DIA. Thanks for being here, Brad, because you are our lone government voice here, and I think it's really important as part of our public-private partnership to have that voice. And Janet is here from Citigroup. She also was 16 years in FBI, so she knows a little bit about government as well. So thanks for being here. So the way we're going to do this today is I'm going to ask some questions of the panel, and then we're going to turn to you all to join in the conversation, and then we're going to have hopefully a fairly tidy stop at 11:30. So I'm just going to move right into our questions. There's been a lot of developments in OD&I and in the IC around open source of late. I'm sure some of you who are here are following this pretty closely. There have been a couple of studies. There's been a lot of testimony on the Hill. There have been other things going on. And I wanted to just turn to Brad to ask for you to catch us up on, what is going on right now in the developments for open source and how the IC is approaching this mission.
Well, thank you, Beth. I'd like to thank INZA as well for hosting this breakout session for everyone attending to come listen to us, especially myself as an open source practitioner and leader in the intelligence community. Thank you for coming this morning. Essentially, as Beth was saying, there's been a robust discussion over the last year plus, hosted by the D&I about how do we modernize those and how do we organize a very dispersed discipline with practitioners across many different components. In fact, all components of the IC are doing something with open source, whether they call it OSINT or not. How do we better organize? How do we use technology and integrate our efforts? So essentially what we've decided to do, one of the key points that we've done is enhance governance. So my agency director, General Scott Barry, the DI director, is the Defense Intelligence Enterprise Manager for OSINT. And then, of course, the CI director is the IC Functional Manager for OSINT. And so we are working closer together in three key areas that I would characterize how we're moving the open source intelligence discipline forward and through an enhanced governance process. The first area is transparency. So transparency of who is doing what, who has what open source data, who's acquiring it, how do we better share that? The other area, the second area I'll mention is integration. So that's better integration across the IC agencies. As many of you know, the DNI, as she expressed during her recent congressional testimony earlier this year, talked about the stand-up of a small OSINT-focused shop at DNI, led by a senior executive, to help with that integration piece. Again, a very important D&I function. And I'm not talking about just integration with the US IC, I'm talking about our other partners. So how do we integrate and leverage our allies, other partners, academia, work closer than ever with industry? The third area we're talking about are increasing our efforts in enterprise solutions. So previously, again, there were lots of different OSINT organizations doing different things without really knowing what technical capabilities, what Tradecraft the others were using. And so we've embarked on a joint effort, a multiple agency effort, that's been coordinated with the full IC leadership. Let's create the first organized Tradecraft for this discipline, instead of let everyone trying to figure out on their own and learn from each other. So this is very much a crowdsourcing effort, but we're already seeing great progress in how do we actually professionalize all the OSINT practitioners, no matter where they sit in the IC. So there's exciting things happening, and we're charging ahead, and we already are starting to see the benefits from that.
Thanks for that, Brad. I think it's really helpful for everybody to hear from a human about what's going on here. And one of the things in the preparation for this, we did have a CIA representative here, Patrice, who's Randy Nixon's deputy, and they were just unable to come for very good reasons. But one of the things that really came out in this prep was just how closely you all are working together and you're friends. And I think that is just so refreshing and positive, and it makes all the difference in the world, right? That this is still a human endeavor, and it makes a huge difference when we have people working collaboratively. I was going to ask Ellen, who you've been thinking about this for a long time. Your company works on it, but you were working on it even when you were inside the IC. When you hear Brad talk about this, what are you thinking? Where do you see potential opportunities, but also gaps in the approach?
Yeah, I'm so happy to hear what you're saying, but what I'm also hearing, though, is that I'm glad that CIA and DIA are working really closely together, but there's 16 other elements that all work in this space. And, I had the great privilege to run the Bureau of Intelligence and Research for a couple of years. And, they've been working with open source for 75 years. In fact, for the most part, their analysts start their day there. And so, I hope that the DNI does move forward on her plan to look at governance and look at the entire IC, because there's so much else that's out there that needs to be brought in terms of standards and best practices and data. And so I think this is an incredible start. I really would like to see the DNI move out on bringing in the other 16 elements, especially the little ones. So there's the little guys that, and Beth, I know you're familiar with them. So the energies and the treasuries, who all do amazing work, mostly in the open space area. And, they need to be leveraged and used. And so that would be an area that I would hope, looking forward, gets a little more focus.
Yeah, I see great potential in the ODNI office, keeping it small, not trying to replicate what is going on, but really being this forcing function on collaboration. And I know that, Brad, you weren't able to go in deeply there, and there's a lot more going on in that space. But I'll let Janet join us now from the private sector potential. When you hear all of this, what are the lessons learned from how the private sector has been using open source, and where do you see this picture evolving?
Yes, well, one point of clarification, we were just chatting this morning. So do you all consider commercially sourced data as open source? When I think about private sector, we've got things that are publicly available, but you also have this subset of proprietary data that you pay for. It could be financial transactions, could be healthcare information, could be satellite imagery. So I think under some definitions that also falls under open source. To level set before getting to the lessons learned, how does the private sector use OSINT? So we're using it in terms of safety and security. We're using it to add value to the business. We're using it for brand protect. I could probably list off, say, 100 different use cases. There are so many lessons learned. The one that comes top of mind is ensuring accuracy. So in this environment of disinformation and in this environment of information overload. I think about going back to our training. I know there's many analysts who are in the audience today, but that training in critical thinking and what we term thinking about your thinking. So top of mind for lesson learned is being able to handle that disinformation that's out there in the ecosystem.
So, Brad, getting back to you on maybe this point about the training and the Tradecraft, who is in charge of figuring out, as you were mentioning, this professionalization of the discipline? It hasn't been declared a discipline yet, but I suspect we're going in that direction. And how can we take these lessons and really start applying them?
Yeah. Well, there are pockets of expertise across the intelligence community and industry and academia, and the challenge is how do we tie that together, and how do we create the standards in the Tradecraft? So we have active efforts ongoing right now looking at that, but I would say it's in the initial phases, and one of the larger challenges we face is the evolution of technology, right? We're following the internet revolution, information technology revolution, and the capability for those to use that for ill purposes, disinformation, deepfakes. And so there are some technical solutions that exist, and how do we scale that up? How do we train a large portion of the intelligence community workforce, particularly the all-source analysts who are tasked with sifting through all this information, and then how do we have specialists who are highly trained who can use technology and special techniques to understand the source and how it may have been manipulated or intending to manipulate us. So that we have some a variety of efforts underway. The Tradecraft's being produced right now. That's going to be available to all the practitioners, but we're really scratching the surface. And again, we're chasing technology. And we have to be as agile and as quick as we can be and rely on a lot of help from outside the intelligence community.
So Janet, to follow up with that, how does the private sector approach this combination of the human element and the technology element in terms of producing more assured tradecraft?
It's changing by the day. So I think ChatGPT, Google Bard, for instance, that to a certain degree, we had been talking about it for so long, but then it just sort of came out of nowhere. So I would say in some ways industry is looking to catch up. From a tradecraft perspective, so we always look to verify data, maybe using other sources. We go back to some tried and true techniques of even collaborating across different industries. So if we look at finance, for instance, if we come across pieces of data that we're unable to verify, we may not just look internally at Citi, but we may talk to some of our partners at JP Morgan or at Bank of America to try to verify that data. The third thing is staying up to speed on disinformation tactics and what threat actors are doing to try to lead us astray. So I always go back to the basics when I think of analysis and how we handle open source information and try to verify information. It goes back to that critical thinking. It goes back to that intuition. If you feel that something is not right, or maybe it's not accurate, that you dig into it, you don't just let it go. Then on the other side of the tradecraft question is, so you've got your open source tradecraft, but then you have how you communicate your results to the decision maker or to the consumer. And that's also where you could employ some structured analytic techniques, key assumptions check and otherwise, before communicating that to your audience.
Yeah, if I could just add one point.
Please.
That's the value of having professional open source officers who understand the sources, who work against these sources of information for the long term. So they have knowledge and they develop the sort of both the deep target knowledge, if you will, from a collection perspective, but also understanding the context in which this information is being presented. And that's why professionalization is a big move across the intelligence community for open source.
I'm going to ask Ellen to reflect on that for a second, but I just want to add that, from my perspective, you all are getting at exactly how I think about this. And I'm always struck by how the private sector, what they do, is so similar to what we do, I used to do, in the intelligence community, and how much there is to learn from each other about these things. So thank you for those remarks, and Brad for adding on there. So Ellen, we're talking now about using AI and these generative AI and these large language models. Do you have any reflections about how this all applies in a positive way?
Well, yeah, and it's
yes, please.
Getting back to the last question.
Yeah,
ask the
please.
question you want asked. I mean, I think the private sector is doing well, but I absolutely agree that it's not. In some pockets, it's doing well. It's so in areas of business and risk and cyber, doing very well. Yeah. But I would say that in other areas, not doing very well at all. And
social media?
Social media, I think just in support to all of us, in terms of our daily lives. And so I do think the IC, the standards, the Tradecraft, this combination of understanding data science and analysis and bringing it together absolutely needs to be better leveraged.
Yeah, absolutely.
But getting to the good news of all of this, I mean, I'm excited about the prospects of generative AI, and it's not new. We've been talking about this forever. I laugh because I remember having been an all-source analyst during the Cold War, we would talk about, needing tools to make it easier for us to do our job, and now they're here. And that's just so exciting that, I really see that, if we can put together a strategy and implementation plan, we're more productive. Now analysts can put their focus on things that are unique to analysts, that once we've got the collections and when we've weeded through the chaff, we can have insights that we can narrow in on and make assessments, and we're faster and more productive. So I'm pretty optimistic about this, especially given some of the things you're discussing that is happening at the D&I level and the DIA and CIA level in terms of this need for a framework and a strategy.
Do you think that we have, Ellen, how do you feel about whether the IC is, ready for these kinds of things? I mean, what are the barriers for us to actually bring in this kind of technology that we're talking about?
Well, happy to talk about this. So I think at the end of the day, one of the primary barriers is I wish we would start looking at, in the IC, that our job is about delivering content to someone. I think that's really where it all begins.
Keep that end state in mind.
And it's not just about phenomenal, eye-watering analysis, but it's about delivering content to someone else. And that you're measured based on that, on doing that and doing that well, providing decision advantage to the president, law enforcement, submarine operator. And so I think that's where I would begin. And the reason I go there is because I think right now our customer really believes that the only valuable content that the IC produces comes from super classified sources. And that's just frankly not the case. But the reality is we spend so much money on these super classified sources that I'm not surprised our customer thinks that, because it's got to be better than the unclass or the commercially available information that's been analyzed. And so now we live in a culture where if we're not producing at that level, it's just not as important. And that's become, and if you're an all-source analyst, you're kind of measured on that. If you don't include all of that, you could be punished for that. You could be hit for that. So now our analysts are highly incentivized to ensure that they're working in that realm. And so this concept of living in a world where the open source brings so much value and richness and information, we're not incentivized by that. And so that really gets to, if we could change our model to delivering content, recognizing that so many of our customers really need content that they can use. Beth, you know that very well, like on a daily basis, not just in the morning, all day long. I think that things would start to change, because now there would be more hunger and desire for information that can be shared more broadly and more easily. And I think there's some things that the IC can do that actually can start sort of whetting the appetite of our customers for more information that's produced at the open source level. I think, for example, in NIEs, why couldn't we include a block in an NIE that is produced at the unclassified level? This would give the customer an opportunity to see that what they're reading at the unclassified level is as valuable as the super double triple gamma. And it would also get your analysts in the habit of starting to produce more at that level. So they're producing here and they're producing there. It's just a baby step, but it would be a big step. So I think that's one of the biggest ones right now, is more focus on the customer and being rewarded for getting information to the customer. And when that becomes what drives you during the day, and I'll tell you, if you're an analyst living 50 miles outside of DC, if you're working for the military or you're working for law enforcement, you're already using open source because you're already incentivized to get information to your customer. You're already using open source.
Yeah. Brad, do you have a reaction to any of that?
I do, and I agree wholeheartedly. I mean, so at the end of the day, it's data that provides the content, right, and answers the key questions for whoever someone is supporting and whatever the topic is. And most of the world's data is not in the IC. It's in the world, right? It's on the internet, it's out there in tons of commercial data, and it's growing exponentially. No one can even measure what's out there, but if we don't figure out how to balance the fusion of commercial data, open source data, public available data, with the super duper great IC data, if we can't do a better job harnessing that data and making it into a coherent narrative that answers that question and delivers the content, we're not going to be successful. And that's why we're investing in open source, and that's why we're trying to get organized, because I think the IC leadership recognizes that. And I know certainly my IC leadership does, and that's why my center exists. We didn't exist 4 years ago. We do now, just for this reason of how do we do this better and how do we maintain our intelligence edge, relying on the world's data.
And I will say, I'm just going to add, because you probably can't add, but I think one of the keys to this is having a sustained investment, an investment stream that you can count on, that you can plan off of, is really one of the main issues that needs to be addressed. If we're serious about open source, then we need to spend money on it, and that is just kind of a basic fact. And you can just look down when I say those kinds of things, Brad. I'm going to stick with Brad, though, in an area that I think it's still controversial. I'm still putting you on the spot, but just not on something that'll get you in serious trouble. But I read the ODNI report by the panel of experts about privacy and civil liberties, about use of social media, which I thought was very important and very bold, and I'm extremely proud of the IC and the ODNI for putting that out, and for Director Haynes saying that people needed to read it, because I think that that's good government. But what are the kinds of challenges that we have like this as we include generative AI and other technologies into our systems in terms of ethics or legalities or just other uses? What do you think about when I talk about challenges of the generative AI?
Yeah, well, from my vantage point where I sit, the number one thing any intelligence officer cares about is the source of the information, right? And so generative AI does great things. We're extremely excited about its potential as well and what it could do for our intelligence missions. But we have to develop the technology to the point that we understand the actual initial sources where the AI is pulling information from, and then have that understanding to go back and evaluate the sources and develop AI generation capabilities to the point where it presents us with that information. Because again, no intelligence analyst is going to rely on a generated gist or summary unless they understand the source and understand about its potential biases or its potential strengths. And so that's just part of the analytic tradecraft, as well as the collection community. So we've got to develop the technology to the point that it will assist in understanding the genesis of the information and the potential biases of the source. But it's an exciting future. We also take U.S. persons' information and our allies' personal information protection very seriously. All intelligence organizations have Attorney General approved guidelines. We have rigorous training. We have policies. We have procedures put in place so we don't run afoul of the civil liberties challenges. And we need to keep up with the evolution in technology. As that changes, we've got to modify our procedures. We have to train against those and always be wary of that, which we are. And so there's a series of things from a technology perspective, a procedure perspective, a policy perspective that we have to continually improve to harness this important information.
Thanks for that. You know, we've danced around this issue about the reliability and accuracy of the information coming in multiple parts of our conversation here. I'm going to ask Ellen, because your company really focuses on disinformation. Truth is in the name. And I wanted just to ask you, you know, how do we ensure this reliability and accountability?
You know, it actually sort of feeds off of what the IC is doing right now in terms of looking at the data and looking at the sort of the analysis side of it. And as I was leaving the IC, it really hit me that, you know, our job in the IC is to provide decision advantage to policymakers and warfighters, but who's doing that for everybody else? Mm-hmm. And I think it is, Janet, I think it is good in some places, but not so good in others. Mm-hmm. And like, you know, as I just look at my own family situation, we all have those family members that think that Russia is just unifying its country right now. It's because they're looking at data sources that are just not necessarily objective or trustworthy. And so it was really after I read Rand Corporation's Truth Decay. That was the book. It was a great book put out by Jennifer Kavanaugh and Michael Rich, who was then the CEO of Rand. And the premise is that this is a problem that is multi-sector in nature. It's not just a technology problem. It's not just a data problem. It needs to be looked at broadly by academia and research and people. We need more public awareness. We need more standards. And I thought that makes complete sense. And so my company, the Truth and Media Cooperative, is about uniting all the sectors that are working this disinformation and misinformation problem. And it is a multi-billion-dollar sector. You know, there is a lot of money going into fighting misinformation and disinformation, but when you look at the data, we are not any better off.
Yeah.
And so when you talk about the challenges in the IC of investment, the same thing is happening in the private sector, where you have all these really incredible capabilities, but they're siloed, they don't work together, and they certainly don't scale. And so trust in everything continues to decline as we continue investment. And you know, you look at OSINT and you look at AI, and this is a field that's going to quadruple in size over the next 5 years. So there's even more money pouring into it, and yet it's not achieving the results that, you know, we think it should be in terms of ensuring that people can make great decisions based on information that they have access to. And so we're a cooperative of diverse but like-minded organizations with the goal of providing people with access to quality information and information that they want, which is equally as important. You can have the best information in the world, but if you don't want it, it doesn't really matter. Mm-hmm. And so how do you do that? And I think this gets to the IC model. We've decided to start with this concept of implementing a common lexicon. And when we talk about that, it's not looking at misinformation and disinformation, it's more looking at information like you would any other critical infrastructure. What does the information environment look like? How do we create a safe information environment? Let's look at words like information quality and sourcing of data and provenance of data, all words we use in the IC. And let's see if we can harmonize that language and gain consensus across media, technology, academia. And so we are working with some other organizations right now to develop that lexicon with the goal of then having standards. Our focus is on the technology platform companies and the AI companies right now, because somehow we need to fund this effort. But I think if you can have a common lexicon that's understood by those who are consumers of information and those who produce information, that's a really good start. And then if you can then provide standards such that not all information is going to meet these standards, but even if you could just get 10% of the data moving across any platform right now that it meets certain standards, it is transparent, we understand the sourcing, we understand the time frame of it. I mean, that's a start. And by the way, that would help in the intelligence community as well, if they could actually understand what that data is. And I think that's something that we need to do with government, and we are working with those in government, but our focus primarily is the private sector, because the question at the end of the day is who's giving decision advantage to my mother?
That's a good point. I'm afraid of the answer there. Janet, do you have a reaction to that, being somebody in the private sector working with this?
So many things.
Yes.
Okay, so something Ellen just said stuck out to me. So you mentioned that in pockets things are going really well, in other pockets not so well. So the New York Times, this just reminded me, the New York Times, a couple of months ago, there was an article about these massive layoffs across tech. Part of those layoffs are the trust and safety teams. These very small teams that are dedicated to fighting disinformation. If things like that quietly happen behind the scenes, we will then face the repercussions, not only in industry, but also in the intelligence community as well, as you try to exploit social media. So that was one thing based off what you said that I just thought of. The second, going back to artificial intelligence, I think it is important, and likely everybody knows this, that it is only as good as the data in the models, and it can be wrong. So very early on, as I was chatting with, I think it was ChatGPT, there were a couple of times where I was going deep in a conversation on cyber attribution, and there were times where the attribution was incorrect. And the last thing that we want as an analyst that's producing a paper is to rely on that one source. So you want that delicate balance of using it as a supplement, but not as a replacement for a human. And inserting that analyst during the right time, but very excited about where we're going in terms of artificial intelligence and how much time that will be saved as a result of it.
I actually think if you could just say that 10% of your data meets certain standards that actually have been developed based on an approach that's bottom up, not necessarily top down.
Yeah.
Then the AI issue has sort of been half resolved if you view that your biggest issue is your data and then bias built within the algorithm. So if you can actually ensure that data meets certain standards, or some data meets certain standards, that's a great place to start.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm going to turn to a couple questions here. This one is, how does your organization engage with tech leaders to understand where the domain is moving? Brad, I think I have to turn to you on that one.
Yeah. We have a multifaceted effort, right? So it's not only the organizations we have existing, work that's ongoing with, through that private sector partnership for technical capabilities and other services that industry provides. It's also how do we sort of do the cast a big net to see what's out there. At DA, we have a sort of a broad area announcement, public-facing website called Needopedia, and that's where we post information about capabilities and services we're interested in that all industry, all academia can look at and see what are we asking for information about. And any organization is more than welcome to send in a responsive white paper to say, hey, we have this cutting edge technology, we have this great service, we have this great concept or idea, we want to talk to you. And so we get these inputs from industry, from this open announcement, and we evaluate that. And then in many cases we down select, and we have the ability to put the questions at an unclassified level for the types of services and capabilities we're looking for. So that's one way where we're communicating to the world, and then we get all kinds of great ideas and concepts that come in through that. We also have a growing partnership with academia. The University of Maryland has an applied intelligence research organization that's part of the UARC, and so we are talking to them regularly. There are a number of other colleges and universities around the U.S. who have open source like classes and curriculum and adjacent degree programs, and these are people we're talking to. We're also leveraging other foundations besides INSA, so to engage others. And so there's a growing academia, industry, government dialogue across the board about open source. And so we're actively interested in talking to anybody and everybody and building the formal mechanisms to both communicate out and also to have informal discussions like this and more structured formations, just like this event today.
You know, if I could add on
Yeah.
to that, there's the monkey in the room that we really haven't talked about yet. Is there this need for another agency,
Yeah.
or another outside entity? So I'll be kind, but I think we do, and I think it really is a nice add-on to what you're talking about, and I think we'll get there. You know, the reality is that this vision of having some outside agency, public-private, that is attached in one way or the other. Either it's in the IC or it's outside the IC. I don't really care about that so much, but something that is somehow connected, that analysts and data scientists and personnel from the IC can go in and out of. You and I were talking about this earlier, Janet, that, you know, this ability to go in and get a sense to see what's out there, see what tools are out there, see what technology is out there, see the trends, and come back is so desperately needed, because the reality is that we're never going to the IC to be able to operate as quickly as we can in the private sector, given security and acquisition and just the nature of our business, that there is something that's, the private sector will always move out faster. And so, you know, to have some sort of an element, some organization that is doing research, that's testing, that's training, that's doing some production, that's somehow connected and working on both sides. I think that's something that is definitely.
It reminds me of what Admiral Sharp and General Nakasone have done in different measures in NGA and NSA in creating parts of their organization that are working in this unclassified space. And you'd think that OSINT might be a place that would be more naturally disposed than NSA, for example, but it's happening. There's a follow-up question here that I think, Janet, may be for you, and it's how the government, so this is kind of more thinking outside in here, can encourage industry partners to share, collaborate, and integrate while still protecting the intellectual property of the private sector and not losing their competitive advantage. I mean, there's always this hesitation, right, of sharing with the government.
Yeah, and I think historically, it can feel like a one-way street. So if that collaboration is two-way, where the private sector comes to the table with something and the government returns with something, even if it's feedback on here's how we used that information, it can go a long way. Or coming to us proactively saying we have this, we would then be more likely to say, okay, well, in our holdings, we have this, let's put our minds together. And I think just slowly building trust over time, there's a lot of different avenues for information sharing and collaboration between industry and the government. But I think building more trust and having more of a two-way conversation and more information sharing is the way to go.
Does anybody have a reaction to that? Brad.
I agree. I mean, I agree wholeheartedly. The more we can integrate all elements of our society and our country and our allies for our collective defense of democracy, the better. And so, creating additional dialogues, mechanisms, quasi-government, commercial, academic organizations, maybe there's a role for some sort of a joint hybrid organization, that we'll see 10 years from now, be up and running. I think the future is unlimited, but I think the circumstances and how we deal with all this data is going to dictate these new, more open-minded approaches about how we work together with all our capabilities.
I think we've talked a lot about how we produce content, how we deliver content, but then you really have to put some focus on what's being done to ensure that people are demanding that content, that you're actually providing value. You talked about sort of the trust and security folks at the platforms and how they're starting to, their staffs are declining, those jobs are being cut, which is sad, but part of the reason is because there's just this basic distrust that what's being reviewed is truly what it is. And so I think this is where the need for public awareness is just so desperately needed. The reality is that, not only is this democracy of ours just so, part of our secret sauce is our transparency and our openness and open data and your ability to form your own opinion, but it's getting taken advantage of. We haven't even talked about the international component to all of this. And so, there's these external megaphones that are taking the stuff that's being, that's already confusing our media ecosystem right now, and it's just amplifying the message, and it's not only very good messages, and people just don't really understand. That's where I talk about this lexicon, and I think people need to understand that the issue is not us, the issue is actually outside, and that there has to be some sort of mechanism that brings us together that says we need to do better. It's not just education programs and critical thinking.
Right.
It's we need to get some sort of a national campaign that makes people truly understand that we're in a state of cognitive warfare, and I don't think, my mother certainly doesn't understand that, so.
Yeah, it brings, it brings to mind this question of oversight, and there was a question from the audience that kind of gets into that. What policy or legal infrastructure is lacking to address some of the ethical or some of these other issues that we're talking about that involve ethics but really involve trust of the information? Are we lacking something from, yesterday INSA hosted Senator Warner and Senator Rubio, and I know they're very focused on these issues, but do we need more of a government role, Janet, in terms of what our expectations should be for the private sector? And then also we'll get back to more of the government side.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say we need more policy, we need more legislation centered around truth in media. No doubt. I think where the challenge comes into play is that you have a lot of reliance on sources of information that are not originating from the United States. And so how do you legislate that globally? But I do believe, yes, we need to do better. We need to come together, understand we have a problem here, and do better on the disinformation front for those companies that are US-based. But then it becomes another challenge on the global front.
And the funny thing is that every time the government tries to do something, it gets slammed. In fact, the DNI a couple months ago was talking about looking at commercially available information, and Representative Boebert from Colorado came in and said, well, I took care of DHS, now it's my time to take care of the DNI. And just last week, you had a judge that put out a law about social media's ability to interact with government. And so the government really is in a very tough position right now on this issue. Every time something tries to happen, they're accused of being the truth police. Mm-hmm. And the irony is that there's anything out there right now that's the truth police, it's the platforms. They're getting hit right now every moment for regulating the content that moves over those platforms. We're in this really weird place right now where the government is having a hard time implementing policies or doing anything, and certainly the platforms are in this position of being looked at as the truth police, but they don't want that job. That's not something that they signed up for. And so who is going to do that? That's where I think the Truth and Media Cooperative and other entities like that, anything that we can start self-organizing and maybe treating information like a critical infrastructure. Most of our critical infrastructure started as self-organizing events. Electricity started as a self-organizing ISAC back in the 60s. I think we need to work with government, but you need the platforms, you need the media companies, you need education, you need everyone to work together on this. I know it sounds very Pollyannish, but it's a big deal. Because government is just struggling right now to be able to do anything. Mm-hmm. And we as citizens have to care and demonstrate that we care. Right.
Yeah, and it is getting much more complicated given that our foreign adversaries are actively participating in this space and encouraging this kind of disinformation. And I think it gets very hard for the intel community, the foreign part of it especially, our traditional agencies, to deal with these issues around separating out U.S. persons who are influenced by foreigners and foreign data, and then how are we synthesizing that? And we have the debate about, FISA coming up. Brad, do you have any views about, just how does this affect our ability to use open source that is, domestic, but it's foreign derived?
Yeah. Well, if we do not have the world's data to look at, we're going to miss something, right? We're going to miss something, and so it's going to be critical for us to make sure that we develop both, the procedures and the trust when we do our job as an intelligence community to protect civil liberties and go after the foreign threats who are trying to, influence us, and in many cases do harm to, not only, our democratic institutions, but our businesses and other institutions, and that of our allies. So we're going to have to figure out how we can both, maintain and demonstrate trust that we're doing things legitimately, and also educate everyone on the importance of, what we do, what we're doing on the American public's behalf, and solidify and increase that partnership with other organizations on the outside who are working the same issues. That's why it's critical. The government's not the solution to the disinformation problem. As my colleagues here have discussed, I agree with that wholeheartedly. This is a national challenge, an international challenge, and it's going to take all components of our society and our citizens to chart the way forward and keep our institutions and our economies and everything else secure and safe.
I wish we could just end there, but we have more time, we have more questions, because that was awesome. Here's a question that it's a little bit more of a detailed question, but I think it gets down to this idea of whether we see open source analysis that is based on what used to be exquisite collection, but now is just readily available. Do we see this as a complement or a competitor? And the person in the audience asked, specifically about the Institute for the Study of War, for example, and how DIA thinks about this kind of analysis.
It's all data at the end of the day. And again, we're taking a very data-centric approach, as is the rest of DoD. And it actually doesn't matter where the data comes from, as long as it's good data, we can verify its source and its authenticity, we're going to use it. And so this is really about fusing the right pieces of data together and then coming up with the processes and the tradecraft to, create a coherent, timely, impactful, outcome of and provide that information and context to the decision makers. So absolutely, it's not one or the other. I don't see it in conflict at all. I see it as all complementary, because again, at the end of the day, it's information, and the sources may vary, but it's how we work smartly to get that information, fuse it together to get the best result for our customers.
I mean, one of the challenges that I found working with senior customers or customers at every level is that they're reading this information, and rarely do we have the Intel analysts they're not reading ISW every day because they don't need to. But policymakers actually want some kind of validation. They want to know, I always talked about, do we have time sometimes to do a good housekeeping seal of approval and say, well, actually, we don't need to be spending our time on this because there's this organization here that's doing this work, we've looked at their model, and we know it's good. And so do we need to replicate that? How do we use analytic work that's being done in the private sector to actually help us in the IC, I keep saying us, sorry, focus in on the things that maybe where we have a distinct value added?
I think that's already happening in some cases. I think that anyone that I know in the open source intelligence business, they know what good commercial, private sector, academic work is being done, and we look at that. Trust me, we look at what's being done. Some cases we learn from it. In some cases, we may have relationships with those organizations. In other cases, we will tell our customers, this is this organization's output, this non-governmental, non-IC organization output. Take this as the answer. And so again, open source means open-minded, right? Which is the title of our panel. It's being able to look across what's good and bad out there and then use it to our advantage. And then that education of the, our senior customers, our military customers, our law enforcement customers, we've got to continue to do that and to highlight the great work that's being done across the board.
See, I think we're not doing enough of that, at least from my vantage point, and looking into some particular organizations. And this is where I see maybe a growth opportunity with this discipline where we have more people that are OSINT discipline people really focused on knowing what's out there and maybe taking the time to figure out what is that model that they're using, and I can validate that model, because sometimes there's a lot of deep data science and work being done, and unless you have somebody that's peeling back those layers, you don't know. Right, and so it's more complicated than, I think it's more complicated, and I'm not sure we have the resources and each analyst has the time now to be doing that kind of due diligence because they're just so busy trying to serve the customer. It's a challenge. So Ellen, sorry,
No, you just said where I was going. But I think, so in the private sector side, part of their challenge is they look at analysts or researchers and intelligence as data.
Yeah.
And so what's happened is that, it's almost that you just figure if I go look through all the data, I'm going to find what I really need. In the intelligence business, we're very interested in what's not in the data. What do we need more of? What is not there? But that's not always the case in the private sector. And so I think this is where the private sector could really learn a thing or two from the intelligence community and this need for data scientists and analysts to work together, but they speak a very different language. And so I think in the private sector, we tend to rely on the data scientists, and sometimes we just don't have those analysts, those critical thinkers who can supplement those insights.
It's
not a collection problem. It's an insight problem.
Yeah. I'm going to end here with a question for everyone of just looking ahead and thinking about what are the potential future advancements or trends in OSINT that will shape the way ahead for the IC, and maybe for Janet, as you think about that for your own work and how that might be something that we should be aware of in the IC. Brad, I'm going to ask you to think first because this is your job.
Yeah. And the thing I worry daily about and focus on daily is one, how do we get a hold of all this information? Again, the world's data is out there. How do we actually look at it, sift through it, make sense of it, use AI, other technologies, other machines, use partnerships, use our allies? How are we going to keep up with it? How are we not going to miss something that's crucial? And so I really think that will define the future of open source. No one knows how big the internet is or what it contains, right? How do we harness that for intelligence purposes to keep us all safe? That's what every day when I go to work, that's the first thing in my mind is how do we advance what we're doing to deal with this deluge of data? And much of this data is vitally important, and it's outside of what the intelligence community is already collecting.
I think this is a great point, and it's actually great for this audience because I think this is where industry, you're really focused and thinking about how do we use data and data science and generative AI and technology to get at this idea of helping sift through and identify core pieces of data. And that is, I think that's going to be the secret sauce, right? That will kind of make or break us. Ellen.
there's I have a million thoughts on this. I think visualization of data is just getting better and better and better. And I think crowdsourcing is just becoming, NGA is a great example of how imagery is crowdsourced and how we're gaining incredible insights around the world based on, uses of commercial imagery and what others are saying. Everybody has a phone now. You look at war in Ukraine and what we've seen in terms of, just average citizens, contributing to the effort. And it's not always good, but it's better than it was before as a result. So I'm so excited about that. But my single answer, I think, is actually gaming. And as you look at OSINT in the future and you look at this next generation, 15 to 25-year-olds are all gamers for the most part in one way, shape, or form. And, not only are we gaining incredible insights and data from those who play in the gaming industry, but it's also an incredible platform to look at potentially how we may do analysis in the future, how we will incentivize, folks to use gaming techniques and gaming as potentially even as a place to deliver insights. I dream of someday waking up and there's my avatar telling me what I need to worry about during the day. And how cool would that be? No, I just think that's great.
I'm actually going to have a robot that helps me when I'm old. Janet.
I think the future of open source is solely dependent on the future of our analysts. So I want to see the best and the brightest hopefully joining the intelligence community. There will be rapid evolution of technology. Make no mistake, but it is going to come down to how we as analysts handle that information, how we assess that information, and most importantly, our ability to think about our thinking.
Wow. Okay. That was a good answer. I'm so glad we had you on this panel today. Janet, thank you, Brad. Thank you, Ellen. I think we've had a great session here today. I'm sorry we didn't get to everyone's questions. I tried my best, but it was hard to read and listen and think at the same time. But I appreciate all of you. We are now going to adjourn for lunch. I wanted to thank again Oracle Cloud for sponsoring this important conversation. Thank INSA and all of the team that made this possible. Thank you very much. And thank you. Off to lunch.